I think another thing that can help us is to compare, for example, Timbuktu at that time as a university town with all of its manuscripts, all of its scholars, and scholars coming from all over, with what was happening in Europe at that time, if and when they had universities or anything comparable to what was going on in Timbuktu.
Yeah, we can do that. We can do that. Now, our research is at its beginnings, but we've got enough where we can start to talk.
Mm-hmm.
There's a French colonial era postcard, which I use as teaching material. Let me explain. When the French colonized what they called French West Sudan, meaning French West Africa, they colonized what is today Mali, Niger, all of that. What used to be the Songhai Empire, they colonized all of it. And then what they did, stupidly, is they took photographs of the different places. So there's photographs of Jenne, Timbuktu, Walata, all of these places they photographed, and they made them into postcards. And so if you were sending a postcard from one part of the French Empire to another part of the French Empire, chances are you're going to come across these. And they did one of Timbuktu, and the postcard says, Timbuktu, again, it's in French, so it says Timbuktu, Afrique, whatever, all this kind of stuff. It says on one of them, the mosque in the north of the town, Sankoré, 11th century. Now, what did they just say? The university mosque is 11th century. Now, let's say 11th century, let's take a mid-date, 1050. Yeah. If you consider that Oxford, Cambridge, Toulouse, Rome, Bologna, they're all after that. They're all after that. So if their date of 1050 is the correct date, then that really would mean that Timbuktu as a university center is before the main European universities. Now, as I said, our scholarship is in its infancy on this question, but we're now finding that there are they think there was possibly 700,000 manuscripts in Timbuktu, and the scholars have found 70,000 of them. And they're still held by Black families, they're still held by Black institutions. And I did have the good fortune to meet the lead book collector. It's a Black man in Timbuktu called Abdul Qadir Haidara. And his business is persuading Black families and institutions, hand over your books, he'll have them scanned, you'll have them digitized, and they get their books back or whatever. And he is working his way through archives to document the manuscripts. And the result is, it's changing the perspective of what we know about the literary heritage of what West Africans were dealing with. And yeah, we're learning some big things. So let me just give you one example.
Okay.
There's a Black South African astrophysicist called Professor Rodney Thebe Medupe. And what he did was he examined 37 of those manuscripts and then wrote a documentary on it called The Astronomers of Timbuktu.
Wow.
Yeah, and then he threatened to do 4 more documentaries. And one was going to be about mathematics, one was going to be about climatology. Yes, you heard that correct. One was going to be about chemistry, and I think one was going to be about botany. And there's an article in New Scientist where they are talking about what's been found, and in the future, he planned to do that research. Now, I don't think he pulled the 4 other areas of research off, but the fact that they were considering doing a documentary on climatology means there's obviously climatological manuscripts that he had obviously seen, and you know.
And the same thing with astronomy. I mean, you know, who would have thunk it, so to speak? You know, we know a little bit about the Dogon, but we don't know anything else about, quotes, ancient astronomers, if you will, in Africa. As a matter of fact, even the concept of astronomy in Kemet has been poo-pooed, as if to say, all of that was developed in Europe in terms of understanding, the Earth not being central and moving around the sun and so on, and all the other things, Kepler and all of what he came up with.
Yeah, yeah.
One of the things, though, that may be worrisome is about the manuscripts. I recall that they were under threat by some of these jihadists up there in northern Mali and so on, Islamic fundamentalists who did not have that kind of respect for these ancient traditions. So hopefully some of those have been saved or secured in some way that they won't be able to get their hands on it.
Yeah, I found out some of what happened. Here's the thing. I was invited by a government minister and an academic in Mali. His name was Professor Adama Samaseku. And he explained, well, basically I spoke to him. I also spoke to a gentleman called Ali Ould Sidi, who was at one time the mayor of Timbuktu. And he explained what happened. The jihadists did indeed burn some manuscripts, some. But what happened was, what the jihadists didn't know is that they put in place in Timbuktu a kind of secret mission to smuggle the manuscripts out of Timbuktu and smuggle them to Bamako. So when I met Abdul Qadir Haidara, he was in Bamako, he was in the capital. And so the manuscripts were quietly smuggled out of Timbuktu to the modern Malian capital. So the jihadists thought they burned everything. No, they burned a few things, but they didn't, a lot more survived.
That's good news. That's very good news. The influence, shall we say, of Islam on African civilization, it plays itself out certainly in the West African civilizations of Ghana, Mali, and Songhai. And I think certainly part of that Moroccan invasion was by the Almoravids, who I think were this sort of radical, if you will, Islamic sect. At least they were very fundamentalist Islamicists in terms of their defeat of the Western Sudanic empires, if you will. And North Africa then was also being invaded by the Arabs. And we know that they came into Kemet around 700 of the Common Era and spread across on North Africa, so that the indigenous civilizations, the Berbers and so on, became absorbed into their civilization, if you will, because Arabic civilization was now advancing, if you will, and they were, what should I say, learning from what they found in Kemet, because that was a big boost for them in terms of that whole era. Just the same way that the Greeks learned so much from Kemet, and the Romans as well. And now the Arabs were coming across and learning, and then they brought that wisdom into Europe. Can you go into that period a bit for us? That was a period also when the Moors, whoever the Moors are, and maybe you can enlighten us in terms of that, and going back to Carthage, etc., and Roman civilization, that whole era, I should say, I think is very important, because there was the mixing of North Africa, if you will, and Europe, during that period of time where North Africa was dominant over Europe, before Europe was able to, and what is it, 1492, whatever the battle was at Koweït. You have to remind me of the event, but when they expelled the Moors, from Europe. So that was the whole period up to the beginning of, well, not the beginning, but the end of the 15th century. And that was from about 700 AD to say 1500 AD.
Yeah, certainly. Okay, what you had was the Arab conquest of North Africa, and that began December 639 AD. So that's the first time the Arabs set foot into Egypt. And then from there, they conquered their way across the likes of Libya, Algeria, Tunisia, Morocco, or, where these places are on a modern map, right? All right, now, the ancient civilization of Carthage starts somewhere around 814 BC. And what you had in Carthage were a mixture of four populations coming together to build the civilization. You had the indigenous people of North Africa, known as the Libyans. And at this time period, the Libyans are Black. You had people coming in from the Middle East called Phoenicians. And the Phoenicians, according to Herodotus, and Herodotus visits them and he quotes them, as they themselves say, dwelt anciently upon the Eritrean Sea. Did we hear that? Dwelt anciently upon the Eritrean Sea. So your Phoenicians, they're coming in from the Middle East, but they were originally of East African origin. So that's your Phoenicians. Then you've got people coming in from Kush, and then you've got people coming in from Kemet. And the evidence of all four sets of people are in there. And I have an archaeological report by two scholars. One was called Gilbert, and the other one was called Gilbert Charles Picard. Basically, there was a book called Daily Life in the Kingdom of Carthage, where they make the astonishing statement, but most of the Punic population had African and even Negro ancestors. So that's your resulting mix. That's the resulting mix. Now, as you know, the great Libyan general came out of that, Hannibal from the house of Barca. And as you know, there's coins of him. So anyone who wants to run up their mouth about what Hannibal looked like, there's coins. And the coins clearly show an African profile, right? And we know the coins are him because the historians have stupidly identified the elephant on the other side of the coin. Do you know that the historians even know the name of the elephant? He's called Surus.
Okay.
Yeah. And they've identified that elephant on the coin. So here's the thing. So you'll get historians that will say, yep, we know who the elephant is, but we don't know who the black face is on the other side of the coin, when you've just told us that you know who the elephant is. Surus. So we know for a fact that's Hannibal.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Now, what then happens is, of course, is the Arabs overrun all of that. That's why North Africa today is no longer Black, right? Now, there are Black people there, but they've been swallowed over. Does that make sense? Now, what happened was the Arabs wanted to conquer Spain, but their armies had been weakened in battle with Africans. There was an African queen called Dahia el-Kahina who stood up to the Arabs. And while she was beaten, she was defeated, she was killed, she inflicted such damage to the Arab armies that they were worried that they can't take Spain in that. So they decided to recruit an African army. And they recruited an African army led by a gentleman called Tarif. And then they recruited a second army led by an African gentleman called Tariq ibn Ziyad. They conquer Spain. And then we get four dynasties. We get the Umayyads ruling in Spain. The Umayyads were a mixture of African and Arab. Then you've got the Almoravids. The Almoravids were Black. They were from Senegal on a modern map. The Almohadis, they were Black. They were from Morocco. And then you've got the final dynasty, the Nasrids. The Nasrids, the founder of the Nasrid dynasty was a white Arab called Ibn al-Ahmar. So basically, of the four dynasties, we can definitely take two. We can split the difference with the first one. And then the last dynasty, as I said, starts with Ibn al-Ahmar, who is definitely white. right? But if you look at the way the Spaniards present it, you know that that dynasty continues all the way down till we get to the last king. Europeans call him Boabdil. The African sources call him Abu Abdallah. The Spanish do every year a reconstruction of the fall of Granada. And then what they have is they have puppets which they carry on their heads. And the puppets represent Ferdinand, represent Isabella, represent Abu Abdallah, and represent Abu Abdallah's mum. And the images they've got of Abu Abdallah, he's black. The images they've got of his mother, she's black. She's veiled, but you can see her black hands. Now, if the Spanish are right, it might mean that the dynasty started off as Arab, and then Africans stepped very correctly to make sure the right person marries the right woman. So the children come out, the right person marries the right woman. So by the time we get to the end of the dynasty, Abu Abdallah is black. Now, how we know for a fact that the majority of the Moors were African Negroes is there's a report that was done, which appeared in Human Biology, and which is a journal. Somebody did an article called Importation of Sickle Cell into Portugal. And what they found was the type of sickle cell that had been introduced into Portugal was known as the Bantu haplotype. And what that means is the Africans that were in Portugal between the 8th and the 13th centuries were indeed carriers of the Bantu haplotype. So much so that the white Portuguese have got that haplotype, and they got that haplotype because of Africans bringing it there. Do you see? And the article also makes it clear we have to distinguish between the sickle cell that got there between the 8th and the 13th century and the sickle cell that came after the 15th century. Now, the reason they're making the difference is the sickle cell that got to Portugal after the 15th century. That was brought there by enslaved Africans captured and brought to Portugal. Whereas the stuff that was 8th to 13th century is the Moorish period. Yeah. All right. So basically, what's in Spain? I've been to some of the Spanish cities: Jaén, Córdoba, Granada, Seville. Basically, half of that stuff belongs to Arabs, half of that stuff belongs to us, especially the city of Seville. So the Alcazaba Palace in Seville, that would have been built by Black Africans. The Giralde, that would have been built by Black Africans.
Yeah, it's and of course, you know, that history extends all across Europe, as well as into England and so on, in terms of ancestry there. Because I'm trying to think of whose book wrote about our ancestry in Europe, and the names that imply that they were Black at some point in time. And of course, one of the names was Moor, whether it was spelled M-O-O-R or M-O-R-E or M-O-O-R-E, etc. And you can find a lot of that now going all the way through.
I think the book you're thinking of, there's a book called Ancient and Modern Britons by David McRitchie. Is that the book you're thinking of?
That's one of them. And there was another one by a Black scholar. I think it's called The Moors in Spain. I think that also documents a lot of that. And then there's some of the knights in the Crusades and so on, who were Black. And you also had Roman emperors, I think, who were Black. There were one or two Roman emperors who were Black. I don't think it was just, but I
can answer that. Yeah, there's one of them where there's no debate whatsoever. Emperor Macrinus.
Okay.
Macrinus is referred to specifically from the documents of the time as a Moor. So there's no discussion about him. The one that most Black scholars talk about, though, is Lucius Septimius Severus.
Yeah.
Now, the images of Severus are debatable, right? So I don't go there yet, but some people have gone there, and there have been some reconstructions of Severus that make him pretty much he's ambiguous looking, but we can claim it. But the one that there's no doubt about is Emperor Macrinus. That one, game over.
It's interesting, you know, in terms of the influence of Africa through North Africa directly into Europe, as separate from the influence of Kemet into Greece and Rome in the earlier period. But there are two major periods there of influence.
Let me throw some more. Let me throw some more. Because what it is because I said, you know, we're pushing the game forward.
Okay.
There's more influence than that, bro.
Okay.
Let me just there's more than that. Let me give you some examples. The Ethiopian script. Some people call it Ge'ez. Okay. Some people call it Ethiopic. There's a scholar called Yuri Kobyshanov, Russian scholar, who wrote an essay which appeared in the UNESCO General History of Africa. And according to Yuri M. Kobyshanov, the Ethiopic script is the parent of the Armenian script, which Armenia is roughly Turkey, and the Georgian script. You know, you've heard of the politician Edward Shevardnadze. Edward Shevardnadze?
Yes, I think I'm thinking of it, but the pronunciation may be different. SZBER, something like that.
That's right, yeah. You know that he's from Georgia.
Okay.
Georgia is one of the states within Russia, you know, the old Russian Empire.
Yeah.
Georgia is one of the states. The most famous Georgian in history started, but their script, and by the way, people watching this, you can test this. Pull up Ethiopic on Google Images and look at what it looks like. Pull up Armenian on Google Images, so you look at what Armenian looks like, and pull up Georgian, and you'll find that the Georgian and the Armenian scripts are derivatives of the Ethiopic script.
Well, let me stick a pin, as they would say.
Yeah.
The recollection in my memory is that there's a black man, a black Russian, who's supposed to have written the Russian script, or whatever you want to call it.
You're talking about Pushkin?
Yeah, Pushkin.
The Russian script predates him, yeah, but certainly he is the first person to make Russian the language of Russian literature, because before that, the elites in Russian used to speak French.
Ah, okay.
Yeah. So one of the most famous pieces, I've got a background in music, one of the most famous pieces of classical music coming out of Russia was a piece by Stravinsky called La Sacre de Printemps, the rite of spring. What? But you may wonder, why is it in French? Because the elites, they would, yeah. And so what Pushkin did, he was the one that said, no, we're going to use the indigenous language and elevate the indigenous language. Yeah. And one really interesting thing, now that you've mentioned him, as you know, his great grandfather was from Central Africa. The empire called Kanem-Bornu. On a modern map, that's kind of where Chad, Cameroon, that kind of area. That's where his great grandfather was from. And what happened was, me and some of my colleagues, we were working on some research, and we found that the great grandfather's name was Abraham Petrovich Hannibal. We found that his palace, yes, you heard that correct, his palace in St. Petersburg still exists. So if you're looking this up, 28 and 29 Tchaikovsky Street in St. Petersburg, Pushkin's African great-grandfather's palace is still there. And they acknowledge, yep, he owned that.
Yeah, it's amazing. I'm just recollecting too that a lot of the African icons are in Russia.
Yeah.
I'm not sure why that connection is, but you know, like the Virgin Mary and Jesus and all that. I hesitate to say in blackface, but you know, in the original colors, shall we say, of who they were, they're present in Russia, and,
Yeah.
and they're on display. I mean, you know, as opposed to them being destroyed or whatever happened to them or painted over by Michelangelo or something else in Europe.
And that's a powerful point. That's a very powerful point. And one of the things is, strangely enough, Eastern Europeans, especially from Poland, are heavily involved in African history.
Mm.
So a lot of the excavations of some of the sites in places like Sudan, some of the research on African architecture in Nigeria was done by Polish people. And is it because they recognize a connection? I don't know, but certainly it's a question that could be raised.
Yeah, I think there are also, you know, pictures of the Virgin Mary and her daughter and her son Jesus in Poland. I've seen pictures of that somewhere.
What happened was one of my friends visited Poland,
Mhm.
and the most famous image you're talking about, Our Lady of Czestochowa.
Mm.
And what happens is they will put that painting on display at special occasions, and you're supposed to kiss the ground in front of the painting. Do you see? And you know, when the Poland was under communist rule,
Mhm.
and the Pope, and for that matter, Lech Wałęsa, moved against the communists to overthrow them, it was a common thing in Poland to wear a badge on your lapel of Our Lady of Czestochowa.
Mm.
Yeah. And that was the sign that you were anti the government, to try and move against the government. And so that's how you ended up with the solidarity movement, Lech Wałęsa ending up in power and that kind of thing.
Mm.
That was that badge representing Our Lady of Czestochowa. That was a big part of the story.
Well, this is you know, fabulous and you know, totally enlightening. I mean, you've done so much work in these areas, and you can you know, open up the area to us to make it interesting for me and for people who are listening. I think we're going to continue in this vein and travel around Africa and to do our own archaeology, shall we say, historical archaeology, as we move. Maybe we'll go next down to the East Coast, and then also down to Southern Africa, Great Zimbabwe, and what have you. But we certainly want to look at the Swahili civilization, if you will, because so much is being talked about it as a possible lingua franca for Africa. But I think most of us don't know anything about who are the Swahili people, what do they represent historically, and so on. I mean, what have they got to do with African culture? I mean, most of us know a little bit about West African culture, or maybe Congolese or something, but I think we're going to continue with our tour.
Certainly. I can speak about the Swahili thing. The very first African country I ever visited was Kenya.
Yeah.
And my business in going there was to explore the Swahili artifacts. So I went to all the museums in Kenya that had those artifacts.
Mm-hmm.
And I did explore, you know, that a lot of the cities are now what they call lost cities. They're ghost towns. And so I got to explore.
I know one was Kliwa or something like that, one of the cities on the coast.
That's in Tanzania.
Okay, that's in Tanzania.
It's Swahili.
Yeah.
But that's in Tanzania.
Okay.
That's on my to-do list.
Mm.
The ones in Kenya that are ghost towns, there's Gedi, there's Jumbalamatwana, there's Munarani. Those are the ones I got to, but there's loads more. But those are ones I could actually get to see.
Mm.
And then there's a living city called Lamu. Black people still live there. It's still got the 3-story houses. And it's really disconcerting because you step back into medieval Africa when you visit Lamu, and you see Black children coming out to play and run up and down. And you're looking at this, it's like, wow. So yeah, I can speak on that. I can definitely speak on that.